In this video, we're going to look at how aggregate supply policies can affect our inflation rate. Now, as we know, inflation is caused by two things: demand pull inflation and also cost push inflation. So we're going to focus on how aggregate supply can affect both demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. So before we go into our analysis, we're just going to make one assumption. We're going to assume that all AS policies can improve our aggregate supply line. So they're not just in theory that they may improve, but they can improve our aggregate supply line. So we see, if we look at inflation and GDP, we can see that the aggregate supply line, initially being here at AS1, has actually shifted to the right to AS. Let's redraw that, AS2. Okay, so we've assumed that our aggregate supply side policies, as implemented by the government, actually work. So first we're going to look at this idea of demand pull inflation. And as you know, demand pull inflation is caused by excessive aggregate demand here. So aggregate demand being C plus I plus G plus net exports. And where aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, this would actually push up our inflation rate. So as we can see, if the aggregate demand curve was initially here, at AD1, if it increases to AD2, we can see that initially, if we look at the graph of AS1, that the inflation rate, possibly being around 2% here, has increased almost double to around, say, around 4%, which is above the government target range. However, if we see that the aggregate supply side conditions has actually improved from AS1 to AS2, then we can see the inflation rate is actually, say, around 2.5%, which is within the government target range of around 2 to 3% CPI. So as we can see, if aggregate supply increases, even during the condition where aggregate demand increases, if aggregate supply also increases along with aggregate demand, we can see that demand pull inflation can be avoided, and that the achievement of the goal of low inflation can exist. So that's how aggregate supply side policies, with the assumption that all aggregate supply side policies actually improve our aggregate supply line or shift it to the right, that it can actually ease demand pull inflation. Secondly, we're going to look at cost push inflation. And cost push inflation is where the producers mark up prices in order to protect their profit margin. So say, for example, a certain product costs $5 to make, and they want to make a $4 profit. And so the cost of this good will be $9. But let's say the cost of production increases to $7. To maintain this profit of $4, they're going to bump up this price here to $11. So that's the idea of cost push inflation, where the general price level in the economy rises because producers would mark up prices in order to protect profit margins when their cost of production increases. So for example, aggregate supply side policies, which are targeted to improve our efficiency, that is, to improve our efficiency, which is output over input, also known as our productivity rates, we can see that if our outputs increase relative to our inputs, which stay relatively constant, then we can say that we are more efficient and that our economy is more efficient. And so by encouraging firms to become more efficient, the government policies or government aggregate supply policies can actually improve their production costs. And so what this means is that when it costs $5 per unit to produce, if we increase output relative to the same amount of inputs, then this would mean that the average cost of production may actually decrease to, say, $3. And therefore, if the producers would want to make the same profit margin at $4, this would mean that they're only going to charge $7. And so the general price levels would actually decrease. And so that's how productivity improvements can ease cost push inflation rates. So overall, as we're going to talk about in further lectures, aggregate supply side policy such as immigration policy, environmental policy, the supply side aspects of budgetary policy, and microeconomic reforms can ease inflation by increasing aggregate supply so as to ease demand pull inflation, and to improve the productivity and cost effectiveness of businesses in order to ease cost push inflation. And so overall inflation can be lowered to the target range. And we're going to go into much more depth as to how each individual policy can help improve inflation rates in further lectures. But now it'd be very, very good for you guys to keep in mind that aggregate supply side policies all try to act, or nearly all of them try to act to preserve our inflation target at around 2 to 3% CPI over the course of the business cycle.